Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the session after this fantastic lunch. I had myself difficulty taking myself away from the great food. I hope you enjoyed it. And now we're ready to talk about great UX despite Agile. This morning, we had a show of hands in this room where people stood up. Those who were developers sat down first, which was a great crowd. And then we had designers sit down, and then we had the other functions sit down. So we have a lot of developers today who hopefully want to know more about design. And I'm glad that I will be able to share with you some of the experiences, including the bad ones that were great learnings from the work that I did with product teams, design teams, and front-end teams. So when we say design, a lot of things come to mind. And the first thing that people think of design is this. We look at design as basic colors. Of course, colors and aesthetics and color theory is a big part of design, but unfortunately that is not the only part of design. However, in certain cases we think of design as, oh yeah, they'll just pick the colors. Another misconception about design is this creative genius thinking, where some of the designers want to believe that they are the creative geniuses. And it is unfortunate that the team also supports that vision, where they say, oh, he or she is the creative person, they shouldn't be touched, they have this magical power, they conjure things, they see things, and they are the creative geniuses that create things. Unfortunately, unless your name is Salvador Dali, that is not the case. The creative genius myth has been a thing of the past for more than 2 decades now. And today, the designers that are good at their job are not the creative geniuses. Instead, they're the collaborative people that work with people. So unfortunately, this also gets into the good understanding of design. Another thing that happens with design is that they are looked as if they are the saviors. So something goes wrong. Let's say that the team is working on a UI, it gets too complicated, and then they say, oh my God, let's talk to the designers. They may fix it. Well, unfortunately, when you go to the designer at the very last minute, there's nothing that they can do to fix the problem, right? They can make it a little bit more bearable, but it is already too late to come into that space and fix things from a design perspective. This morning, if you had listened to Paul's talk in this room, I think he gave a very good example of what design could be for different disciplines, and this gets in the way of that, and it blocks that good progress that you can get from design. Well, we talked about what design isn't, so let's talk about what design is. I am going to share with you a model that shows different design maturities. This is developed by Jess McMullen, and it has 5 steps. I'll start at the very bottom, and then I'll move up. And then we'll talk about how it overlaps and where it distracts and takes away from how agile thinking works for software development and for projects that has a design component. So I'll start with at the very bottom, where we have unconscious design. This is the design space where there is absolutely no conscious thinking. You just say, I kind of need a container. And you see one and say, yeah, that looks good. I'll just make 1,000 of that. So there is no thinking about what the users need are. There is no understanding of how procedures work. There is no understanding about how the production facilities work. No understanding of stakeholders. Users needs nothing. It's basically saying, I think I can make this, and I'm just going to build it. A good example from the digital realm is the front ends for most command line tools, right? If you have n flags, you need to have n factorial controls on the UI so that whoever uses this thing, they should be able to exercise any options. Again, no thinking about what the user may need, no thinking about the ergonomics. It's basically saying it was there, I made it. It's very unconscious design. Another one is this example, which I just love. This is a website which I think uses every single HTML component to the max, to the point that they have a working chicken in this text box. And it is working. I mean, they sell cars from this side. The fact that it's just not very user-friendly. It doesn't take into consideration the user needs. So that was unconscious design. On top of the unconscious design, we have the design for style. And the key for design for style is that it looks great. There, you don't need to think more about that. The fact that it just looks great constitutes as a design object. And sometimes this is needed. There are things where we just need to make beautiful, and that is, where we can't stop. But unfortunately, this level is not very useful to get to hidden user needs and satisfying hidden user needs. This is always this always creates interesting issues. Here's an example for this. Someone said, well, you know, the Sony controllers look very good, so I'm just going to copy the style and I'll just name it something else. So they said, you know, the style is good. I don't care if it's working or not. It just looks good. Another example is from this company. So this company makes aerosol sprays for killing bugs. And apparently they did a really good job in selling these and marketing these. They have a nice branding, you know, bright colors, they stand out on the shelf. And at some point they thought, well, we are good at, you know, producing these aerosols, and we know how to pressurize things so that they can spray out. Let's use this to make cooking spray as well. And here's what they did. Again, style is good, you know, it looks good, it probably works, but not for the benefit of the users, probably. In the digital space, we see this as when we look at the template websites. Whenever someone says, hey, I need a website, they go to a template website and pick a template. I guess the question is why? You want to make it look good, but it really doesn't, the whatever template that you find may not be meeting the end user needs or may not be satisfying all of the other constraints that you have. It will help you make your product look good. Similarly, there's a website called Behance where designers do some of the experimental designs. They take existing applications or websites and they redesign them. They look good, but we can't really say that they actually meet any end user problems, because the people who designed the Uber app, the Facebook app, whatever, they probably don't work at Facebook. They're not affected by the design choices that other departments at Facebook and Uber make. They're basically in their living room, exercising their creative muscles, creating very nice, very stylistic, very artistic things, but not necessarily good user experiences, which is a big distinction. On top of the design for style, we now have the design for form and function. This is the space where we are getting really excited about actually understanding user problems and solving them. A very good example for this is the OXO vegetable peeler. I bet someone has this at home. Do you have one? I mean, it is a very nice thing. So the OXO company basically had an insight. They said, well, here's the classic vegetable peeler, probably very easy to manufacture, so it is very commonly used, but it is very hard to use for people with arthritic pain. They cannot squeeze or hold the device in a comfortable way. It causes them a lot of pain when they're trying to peel very simple vegetables. So they looked at the problem space and thought what they can do with this so that they can provide a solution to this simple problem. And as any good designer does, they did a few iterations, they tried a few things, and they reached at the model that you see on this side of the screen. It is very comfortable to use for people who have the arthritic conditions, but even if you don't have those problems, it is still a very nice thing to use as you're peeling and as you're preparing your food. So this is a good example of form and function, because they found a problem and they worked with the form and the function of an object to change this into a better experience, not only for the people who have pain, but also for the people who are using it in a different way. When we are looking at it from a digital perspective, this is mostly where the design teams that we work with are standing. They work with the end user, they try to look at the problems from a user-centered perspective, and they make sure that whatever digital experiences that we are creating are solid, they're consistent throughout, and they actually look good and they can be produced properly. Design style guides are a very good example of this. Some of them are at the very low level where they standardize colors, typography, some of the screen layout. Some higher level design guidelines also standardize some of the design principles, some of the flows, some of the reused components within the product, so that people can actually use those forms to solve functional problems and create better user experiences for their users. Now, these three styles are things that we see on a day-to-day basis, whether in the digital realm or in the real world, but there are two more steps, two more maturity levels for what design can do for us and the business. The level up is the problem-solving design. This is where the design perspective, the design thinking, the design approach looks at a problem and solves it at a ground level. This is always done with an interdisciplinary team, with a lot of people working together, making sure that the problem at hand is understood from different perspectives. People are not honing on one problem at a time, and they try to come up with as many solutions as to the problem at hand as possible, and then validate it. The outcome for this type of activity is rarely an application or a website or any computational thing. You probably have heard of service design, where you're creating end-to-end experiences for your customers, which may have nothing to do with a digital approach, but it may have something to do with how different humans interact within the system itself. Again, this is a much larger interdisciplinary approach that aims to solve a human problem using design-centered methods. On top of this, which is the pinnacle of design from a strategic perspective, lies the reframing design, the type of design that takes a problem and works it so well, so deeply, that it changes the frame of reference for that problem. And a very good example for this is furniture. Especially in Europe, furniture used to be something of a status symbol. You would have really good quality handcrafted furniture that is comfortable, that shows that there's craft in it. There has been, a value that was put into it. Some cultures value being able to have a furniture and pass it down to generations, so durability is an issue. But all of these design constraints make furniture sometimes more expensive and maybe not appealing to every type of people. So in the furniture space, the design problem is, how can I create something that is solid, crafted, and I can pass it on to my generations down the path. One company challenged this and said, we can do all of this, but maybe one of the design parameters that we can introduce could be the price. And that is what IKEA does. IKEA takes not only the standard ergonomics or whatever constraints that a normal furniture designers do, they also factor in the price. So that is, they take the furniture problem and reframe it to a point where they look at the price as a design factor and design around the price itself. Another thing that they do is they design around packageability. So if you can't take your design and decompose it into a flat container, IKEA doesn't sell that, because that is how they are reforming their logistics infrastructure, and that is how they're helping you carry the furniture that you buy from IKEA to home. For the digital area, App Store is an excellent example of this. Many of you are developers here, and I think everyone knows that the App Store notion isn't new. Apple did not invent the App Stores. FreeBSD had very good repositories for App Stores. Any mature Linux distribution has a lot of repos where you can just install apps. So that is essentially an App Store, maybe without the comments or ratings. But what Apple did is to take this metaphor and apply it to an already BSD-powered system. By doing this, they exposed a new ecosystem of possibilities to the end users, essentially creating a black slab that you can always keep fresh, that you can always feel as if it's new by installing new apps. And by doing that, you also make sure that Apple makes a lot of money from this. And they also expose the developers to a new ecosystem that wasn't there before. So this is an innovative way of looking at things by reframing that app distribution problem as an ecosystem problem and creating a solution that no one really has thought of before. So we looked at how different types of design creates different outputs. We started with the unconscious design, where we just made things. We moved up from that to form and function, where we used functional interventions to solve problems and make things easy for the users. And then we moved up and looked at reframing design. Now, let's take a step back and look at how agile development started. On the contrary to the popular belief, Agile didn't start in 2000. It started in 1960s. The first mentions of iterative development started in academia or in institutions where they took software development seriously. This was a graph from Winston Roy's article in 1970 that shows the classical waterfall pattern, right? He goes into detail about how system requirements follow the software requirements, and then you have analysis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that he says very clearly in this paper is that this doesn't work. He says that anything that relies on this type of behavior is inherently flawed, because you are amplifying all of the assumptions that you did in the steps before, at the end you have something that is completely unreliable. So he says you should do something similar to this, where you should be able to bounce back and forth between different stages. And to be able to do these, he lays out 5 different principles in this paper. I'm going to share with you the third one. He basically says, do it twice. He clearly says that if you have something that you're giving to your customers, especially if you're doing it the first time, you should do it twice. And here's the actual paragraph where he says, you should do it twice. To me, this is an excellent example of an MVP, where you create an internal prototype, where you work things out, and then you do another revision on top of that to create something. Some people may say that, well, yeah, that's a paper. I mean, he's an academic. He probably, didn't see the real world in those times. Well, actually, that is how things worked. Apollo is one of the big projects that we did as humankind. Essentially, we put a human in the space itself. Here's a comment from one of the engineers that worked on that project. NASA is not as waterfall as you think. Obviously, the Apollo space program involved a lot of documentation, but really, from a software development perspective, it was much more iterative and probably more ad hoc than we would have liked. Jim Highsmith worked in ThoughtWorks. He also is one of the original signatories of the Agile Manifesto. So the concepts that we were talked about at that time wasn't some esoteric academic stuff. It was actually used in the industry. This is very interesting because he says, more ad hoc than we would have liked. Like you put a human in space. Like, I don't know what else he was expecting at that. But again, it produced reliable software and it produced amazing results, and it was iterative. After that point, we had more we started having more structured approaches to iterative development. In 80s and 90s, we had the spiral, rapid application development, and the V model. In the 1920s, we had Crystal, DSDM, functional development, Unified, Scrum, and XP. And in 2000, we started having more inspiration from the Toyota Lean production, where we saw Kanban, Lean, Agile Unified Process, Disciplined Agile Delivery, Safe, Nexus, and all that. We still have growing frameworks in this area. Some of them are more heavier than others, but still, there is a lot of succession about how Agile is proceeding. But all of this is actually made popular by the Agile Manifesto in 2001. Which is, I think, a very brief, very good capture of what Agile stands for. It basically says individuals and interactions are more important than how we use processes and tools. It is more important to respond to change than to promise something and follow a plan. Working software is more important than writing a report, writing an analysis, or sending an email saying that I'm done. And customer collaboration is a lot better than just negotiating over contracts. These simple things, four simple ideas, describe a lot of the successful projects, and I think they also have been used in a lot of successful design projects as well. To these 4, I would like to add one more, which is craftsmanship. I think we all are in an age where we take pride of the things that we're doing. Most of us aren't working in the woodworking space, for example, or most of us aren't cooks by a full job, but we do take care of the code that we're writing. We make sure that it is elegant. We want to be proud of it. We want to be able to say, hey, I wrote this proudly, when someone else says, oh, where did this come from? So there's a lot of craftsmanship going on as well, especially in teams that are using Agile with higher ownership. And this really overlaps and supports how designers work. This is an example from Ford's lab, where they are making a full real-size Mustang using clay and just razors. So they're shaping the entire car as a craftsman to make sure that it is the right shape, right form, so that when they produce it at the scale, it just has the right feeling. It satisfies the users in the way that they have intended. So there's a lot of commonality between the design and craftsmanship and the coding as craftsmanship. Another thing that you may be surprised is that there is a lot of craftsmanship that goes into typography. When you are making a font from scratch, you decide on all the shapes, how things flow, but then you need to make sure that it works on different sizes on different screens. So one of the things that people may not know is that people who write fonts, they write amazing Python scripts to make sure that their kerning is right, their sizing is right, and everything is harmonic, whatever font size you're using it. Another craftsmanship in the design space is all the micro interactions. those little animations that happen when you tap something, when you drag something, when you hover over. Every millisecond matters in those interactions, and many different properties from color, shading, Z ordering changes when you do something as simple as moving something on the screen. And it requires a lot of craftsmanship on the UI designer side to get this right so that it is delightful for the user. This craftsmanship not only applies to the things on the screen, but things off the screen as well. Has anyone ever run a usability study with more than 10 people? Okay. Have you ever been a part of a usability study? Okay, so I see a few heads. Preparation for a good usability study is like preparing for a wedding. You need to make sure that you have the guests right. You need to make sure that you have the right guests. You have to make sure, whoever is arriving at one point, you need to make sure that you're giving them the right feedback, walking them to the right task, walking them out of the lab. There's a lot of preparation that goes on there. It's like a party just done with in a usability lab. So that craftsmanship is a good overlap with the things that we're working with. Again, individual interactions is also something that is something that you see in the design space. Some examples from the Agile Manifesto, where they say you need to build projects around motivated individuals, you need to have the face-to-face conversations. And a good example for this from the design space is inside of the Macintosh, the original Macintosh. Steve Jobs was so adamant that the developers and the people who worked on the original Mac were called artists. So what they did was, like the artist, they actually signed the inside case of the original Macintosh. Here's an amplified view. You see Bill Atkinson here, Dan Kotke here. This is Steve Jobs. So they actually physically signed the computers that changed the history for many ways. Responding to change is also something that agile approaches share with design, where both the designers and the developers welcome, changing late changes in the game. They accommodate agreements over maybe meetings that have taken place a long while ago, and they both use their capabilities to create value for the end user. And this is how all good design studios work. Any studios that are like IDEO and like Frog, down to small studios that do good customer innovation, they work by responding to change and make sure that they work to create value for the end users. Now, these are great similarities, but then we start to see some differences. One of the things that Agile says is that the measure of progress is working software. For design, that is the opposite. We sometimes create inspirations, insights, prototypes that have nothing to do with software. The goal to create these is to see those little perspectives, new futures, and then not necessarily produce something for the end user. Another thing that we do is we actually talk with the end users a lot, which produces no working software. So this kind of exercise, this kind of practice differs from what Agile says is valuable. Another thing is customer collaboration. I think it is fantastic that the Agile framework says you have to be working with your customers, you have to be engaging them at each step of the process. The thing that it misses is the fact that your customer may not be the user. That is where the designers are working with the end user, as well as the customers, as well as the other stakeholders. Agile, especially Scrum, outsources this thing. It says, you have a product owner, I don't care what they do, but they'll just bring us the requirements and we'll build them. That is not how design and successful design projects work. So there's one difference that among these two approaches. I am going to add one more thing here, which is uncertainty. One of the reasons that Agile development, especially Scrum, is very popular is because it is a very good antidote. It's a very structured antidote for uncertainty. I am sure you are either working with a Scrum team or you have seen one. They have burn down charts, which is a very simple estimation tool. You say, I have N amount of work, and in unit time, I do M amount of work, N minus M. You draw a line that shows your rate of working, which is called the burn down. And then you compare it to your weekly weekly workload. This is very good because it helps the project managers, all the stakeholders to see whether you are actually closing down or you are actually adding work. For the design side, we sometimes deliberately add uncertainty to the process to senior perspectives. This is a very fundamental chart that is called the double diamond process. This is created by the Design Council UK, which it basically shows how a particular design project works. It starts by taking a problem, it creates alternatives, and then it decides on what problems to solve. Again, it starts with creating solutions and then chooses among those solutions to get one good solution for the end user. And this is so common that you see it in every single design material. This is the classical design thinking process from the Stanford Design School. This is a material from IDEO where they're showing their design process in 5 steps. This is an example from Frog, which shows that, opening up, going back, adding uncertainty, then reducing uncertainty. So there is this fundamental difference between how Agile thinks of uncertainty and how design manages uncertainty. So we talked about 3 areas where there's a lot of commonality between design and Agile. We talked about 3 areas where there is significant differences to the point that it actually makes it very hard to create good designs. Are you surprised? I'm not, because it clearly says it's Agile for software development, right? Those 4 principles may not apply as equally to design itself. But I think we can do 4 things, 4 very simple things, to bring these 2 worlds closer so that we have much better experiences. And they apply for anything at this level all the way up. And as we move up, I think what I'm going to share with you gets more important and has to be a part of the team. The first step for creating good user experiences in an Agile environment is to know the design goal of our project. We talked about 5 different levels of design maturity. For some projects, it is okay to just make things simple. So it's like just putting on makeup, right? We just make the UI beautiful, and that may be the design goal of the project. But if you are doing something more significant, like opening up a new dimension, sending people to space, or creating a new paradigm, your approach to software development and the way that you're using Agile should be different. And knowing this upfront helps the designers as well as the developers in having the expectations how to move forward in the project. The second thing is to decide on how you are using Agile, especially Scrum, in your production workflow. And there are, in a simple way, 2 ways that Scrum, especially Scrum, is used for the Agile. So I'll just briefly show you 2 graphs that summarize how design and development works in these 2 models. So in the first model, we have parallel sprints, say 2 weeks each, and then the design team and the development team works together. In this model, the design team works on things in advance, and then they pass it on to the development team for them to work on. In fact, they don't have to follow this particular structure. They can just work anytime, and then when the time comes, the development team takes these from the backlog itself. This we call the factory approach. This is basically design team creating a backlog and development team being responsible for working this backlog towards completion. Another alternative could be, again, the same 2 design teams, this time working in a very different schedule. They have synchronized sprints so that whenever a design work starts, it either completes within the same sprint or it is complete in a closer way. This is what we call the product approach. In this case, 2 teams work closer together, and at the end of each sprint, there is an increment that increments the design side as well as the product side itself. There is the bigger differences between these 2 things are, for the factory approach, the designs are delivered. If you're using the word, the designs aren't delivered yet, you're probably working in the factory space. There are 2 separate backlogs, the design backlog and the development backlog, and there are actually 2 teams working, on different schedules and different approaches, which need to be coordinated among themselves. For the product approach, design is a collaborative team effort. Designers do some of that, but in some cases, developers also do some of the design work within this space as well. There is one backlog. The definition of done may include things about the design, maybe whether it has been subject to user testing, whether customer feedback has been received. But what team defines the backlog items as single items in the backlog, and there's one self-coordinating team. Trick question: which one is better? You said the product. It actually depends on your project. I think the product one creates a lot more satisfying things, but there are many successful teams who work on the factory approach as well. I used to work as a senior vice president in Garanti, which is the Turkish branch of BBVA, and most of our teams were in the product space. Most of the BBVA teams were in the factory space, and for the particular types of projects that they worked on, it was fine. But I kind of agree with you, where the product team, the product side of working can be a little bit more efficient. But the problem is, once you have 2-week sprints, or maybe even shorter, you don't have time or reason or the space to do some of the strategic design activities that will allow you to have a much more mature, much more impactful design cycles. And for that, I am recommending a different approach. So for that, you can start with your development and your design cycles. Again, I would recommend going closer to the production space here. But on top of that, you create, you create a discovery path. This discovery path sits on top of all of the activities that you're doing. And in reality, it actually extends beyond the beginning of the development, and maybe it extends beyond when the development is done. This track is about understanding the user needs, looking at business from a different perspective, creating experiments, validations, and everything that will make sure that whatever the design team and the development team is working is valuable to the end user, and it makes sense from the product perspective. Overall, this is an activity. This is not a role. Like we said, Scrum has this bad behavior of saying, oh, like, you are the product owner, you take care of this. This is for everyone. Developers, test, QA, analysts should be a part of the discovery process so that they can bring back insights to the process itself. The outcome for this track is business cases, maybe new usages, product principles, design principles, and themes. Rarely ever you come up with something that is maybe at a UI level. The color decision is not necessarily a discovery activity. There are some methods that say that discovery path should be a completely different thing, and there should be like monthly sync meetings where things are passed on. I would recommend against that, because these two teams have already figured out how to work together in the Scrum, in Kanban, or whatever team Agile approach that they're using. So the discovery track work should fall into the same ceremonies and provide the feedback within those ceremonies instead of creating yet another meeting, yet another backlog, or yet another thing to worry about. So you're going to ask, if this is an activity and not a role, and if we have the same amount of people, how are we going to actually find the time to run the discovery activities? I think that is the part where we need to talk about scaling design, where everyone on an Agile team should be able to carry out basic design activities. They should be able to carry out basic user research, which, if you have time today at 5 o'clock, I am going to talk about that. And the developers should also have time to work on more interesting things, more strategic visions, by freeing up their time from manual work, maybe by switching to modern DevOps practices and having a more streamlined workflow together. So once you decide on how you're going to design, and once you know that the type of work that you're doing is a factory versus a product model, you actually need to know your designers. When we say designers, that's a very big umbrella, but there are 4 main different types of designers that work in digital spaces, and they do very different things. We all know UI designers. They're responsible for color theory, dynamic layout. They're basically directing our attention as we are using whatever product that we're using. Then there's UX designers. This is a much bigger umbrella term for interaction design, information architecture, maybe some user research. Then we have service designers who are working at the higher level, looking at the entire customer experience, entire employee experience, and coming up with the operational flows as well. And then finally, we have the graphic designers. These are the people who are creating the visual experience, the visual environment of that digital experience. This can include anything from illustrations, animations, any offline content, banners. It's basically that visual universe where this digital experience lives. As you see, not all of these people are equal. So if you are working on a problem that needs absolute attention to the minute level of details, a service designer on an agile team may not be very helpful. Whereas if you're working on a problem that is solving a significantly strategic problem, a graphic designer may not be the first person who will be the most impactful on that team. So knowing who you are working with, what type of designers you're working with, will help you a lot in getting that right balance in your agile journey. And finally, most importantly, you need to be able to give your designers a divergence and a convergence space. What we mean by that? So we saw this diagram, the Design Council's double diamond model. It essentially boils down to this shape, where all of the creative endeavor happens across this two triangles, like one big rhombus. On the left side, you have the divergence. This is where you create your possibilities. This is where you do your ideation. This is what they call the creative space. Once you're done with divergence, once you're done with creating alternatives, then you start to converge. When you start to do trade-offs, think about refinement, this is the time where you're having those decision meetings where you need to focus on certain thing. The shape is very generic, but in reality, it can change, right? On some problems, this is how your divergence convergence looks like. You create a lot less time and effort in creating alternatives, but you spend more time refining and hitting that right solution. In certain cases, it takes a long time to talk about alternatives, but once you're done, you know what the answer is and you do it. It is rarely as simple as that in real life. This is what it more looks like. You have like one thing converging and then diverging again and again at different sizes until you actually get to a solution. This is the essence of creative thinking. This is the essence of what we call the design approach, where you start with a problem, you look into alternatives, you are looking into abductive reasoning methods to come up with alternatives, and then you work with your users, you work with your data to validate or invalidate so that you get one design solution that is good for everyone involved. Problems happen when these two things collide. When you are trying to converge, and if someone is trying to diverge, it creates those distinctions. And I think every developer had felt some of that. Most common example is, hey, you go to your designer and say, I have a new idea. How do they respond when you are working with a designer? Are they enthusiastic or are they critical? The answer is it depends. If you go to your designer when they're diverging, they love it. They say, "Oh yeah, this is a very good idea. Let's play with it." And they take on the ownership and they play with it as well. But then, as you're converging it, when you come up with a new idea and you share it with them, or you say, "Oh no, we can't do that," they go crazy. They know that they were expecting this. They know that it was not in the solution space. They want to know why it's happening now. So this is a very important thing to create in those projects where you have a divergent and a convergent space as much as possible for designers and anyone who wants to solve problems from a design perspective. Today we talked about four main items, where we started with the history of how iterative development began. We talked about the different layers of different levels of maturity for design, and we tried to see where they overlap and where they conflict with each other. There were areas where they are completely at odds, but there were also areas where they came together really well. For areas that they conflicted, I recommended four things. One is knowing the design scope of your project. Second, deciding on your approach, how you work with designers, and maybe adding a separate discovery track to tackle more important, more strategic problems. We talked about four different types of designers, which can increase in the future as immersive technologies like AR and VR are getting into our lives. And we talked about the essence of design thinking, the convergence and divergence, withholding judgment, refinement, and doing this over and over and over again. If you have gone through this agile transformation, you may remember that it was a little hard to shed the old practices as you moved into more agile thinking. This could be one of those challenges. Working in an agile environment with these added things could be another challenge. But I am confident that once you're over that challenge, you will have a fun team, a very efficient team that you work with, who creates amazing user experiences no matter what you're doing. And hopefully that will make you a proud owner of the work that you're doing. Thank you very much. We have, thank you. We have 1 or 2 minutes for questions. I'll be happy to take any comments or feedback that you have as well. Yes.
How many people in the team do you have experience with?
The question is how many people, teams that I have experience with.
How many team members in one team? How many developers? How many designers? How many?
Oh, okay. So the question is how many how an ideal team needs to have how many designers versus how many developers? Okay, so very hard question. The general rule of thumb is around 6 or 8, right? You know, that's what most agile literature says. 2 pizza teams, where if you order 2 pizzas, you should be able to feed them. Design and development, although they are, you know, similar, they may not overlap at certain places. So my recommendation would be if you have a software development team that does that deals with end users as well, I'd say 6 to 8 people for the development side, maybe 1 designer who knows about the production side of things, more closer to the UI side, and part-time UX designers, service designers that are coming in and out of the project. At the beginning, I would recommend to have everyone on the same team at all times. So maybe like 10 people, 4 designers, 6 developers, all in the room working across the same goals. Sprint Zero is an excellent thing. Although I am a little critical about Scrum, one of the things that they do well is a Sprint Zero. So if you have time and budget, I would recommend having maybe like 4 to 6 weeks of a Sprint Zero so that you get all your principles right, you work with your users, you look at the strategy, and also you decide on how you are going to scale design across everyone. So 4 to 6 weeks is more than enough time to create a simple usability guideline. You can create a good UI kit where everyone would be able to put together simple screens and use that time to make sure that your designers can then work on the discovery track as much as possible. Once you have a new epic or a new big theme that you need to start building, then you can pull people from the discovery track back down to the actual production line to work on that, maybe for a couple of sprints, and then they can move back to the discovery. There's also another approach which was actually championed by Microsoft a while ago, called Write, where once you're done with your sprints, say like your sprint T, the design team is responsible for testing the T-1 and providing input to T+1, where if they're going to build something, they basically say, you built this in the previous release, in the previous build, it doesn't work, here's what you can do for T+1. That is also another way that the designers can work within the sprints without actually blocking any of the developers. That would be my take. Thank you. Please.
I'm a bit astonished that you are always talking about the design team,
Mm-hmm.
but you are looking more into cross-functional teams, so designers are really part of the team.
Mm-hmm.
So right now you were saying like maybe in Sprint Zero, but it seems you're not recommending really cross-functional teams.
If you can afford that, by all means. I mean, it is very rare to have companies that can actually hire designers at the ratio that I mentioned, where you have like, I'd say, so 64 is 40% designers, 60% developers. If your company can afford that, by all means. I mean, they should be as a part of that Scrum team, the Agile team. In reality, that rarely happens. I mean, I have seen many big corporations having maybe 1 designer serving 3-4 Scrum teams. If you can afford that, by all means. What I mean by design team is that, the reality where you have 10 designers serving 100 developers. But
Just one comment.
Absolutely.
I absolutely understand. However, it sounds like the same discussion we had in the past when you said like, oh, we can't afford to have more than, I don't know, let's say 3 backend people for the whole company, and therefore there is no way of having people knowing about backend for every actual team. And you overcome that, and maybe that's the next thing to overcome.
That could be. I think scaling design, and if you're into the literature, there's this relatively new approach coming up called design ops, which is really like DevOps, but from a different cycle for the design operations. My interpretation of that is, you create systems of design so that everyone can be able to design things. And also you offload a lot of the operational logistical thing to the design ops team. In mature organizations, like since 10 years, this role has been called a design PM. Now it's good to see that it is being more widely available. But as you mentioned, it seems like the backend problem, and I think there's a solution to that. Thank you very much. I'll be around if you have any questions. And again, if you have time at 5 o'clock, I will be talking about user research for everyone. That includes you. Thank you.